So we really just want to think to ourselves and pay attention which tempos the opponent use. If they're using a ton of tempos, so say you lunge, you use all your tempos and I just squeeze my hand and step, now I have like a ton of different things I can do. I can free it with my hand, I can use my wrist for a cut, I can use my body, and I can use my feet or my arm extension and all these different options. So it's really just breaking down to, once you get to the high level, knowing exactly which tempos they spent, why they spent them, and then saving your tempos. It's not about sword before body. It's not about whether or not to do sword before body. It's purely about saving the tempos you need for when you need them. And everyone is overlooking this. They're so worried about, do I do sword before body? Do I not do it? When it's like, okay, if you know the hand tempo is the fastest, people are getting obsessed with, do I use this first or not? That's not the answer. It's when do I use it? When do I use my fastest tempos? When do I save my fastest tempos?
Okay.
When do I use my slowest tempos? When do I use the tempo that allows me to mutate more? The tempo that allows me to void, the tempo that allows me to gain range. So it's all about understanding all the separate segments to know when to use them, why to use them, and how to counter which ones your opponent is using. Most people aren't even aware of it. They're just aware of hand and feet. So like a good way to think about it is like most people pay attention to tempo of the feet, and most people always do sword before body. They're like, I'm going to extend my sword and lunge.
Right.
And so they're using up like a shit ton of their tempos all at once, especially if they cover the line too. Mm-hmm. And they pretty much used all of them. But realistically, since you have so many different segments, as I said before, I could throw a descending cut, okay, and then you go to parry. I could just move my body, which changes the angle of the cut, and then I can also use my wrist, okay? So I'm paying attention to saving my tempos for when I need them. So if I don't need to use my feet, then like I wouldn't. And so for example, if you attack me, I could step, parry, cover both lines, lean, and like use all my tempos at once, and I'm extra safe for that moment.
Right.
But I used up all my tempos. So if you trick me,
yeah, because I felt pretty safe because you didn't seem to have anything you could attack me, so I could retreat safely.
Correct. So now when we talk about, if I can just pay attention to and know exactly which tempos the opponents use, then I always know which tempos I want to use or need to use based on which ones are faster or my goal. So like, for example, if I have perfect measure and say you attack me and all I do is use the tempo of the wrist and you used all of your tempos.
Right.
I still have a tempo of my feet left, still have a tempo of my body, and all these other tempos, and still have a tempo of my arm. So I just shut down a ton of your tempos while just using one of mine, and now we're in a range where all I have to do is extend my arm, right?
Right.
Say I extend my arm, and then you go to parry with your arm because that's the one tempo you have left. So the other hand.
Oh,
yep. So, and you go to cross parry. So now what I could do is I can use the tempo of my body just to turn under it so I can still get this cut and step out with my feet.
Okay, so that brings up a very interesting question. When I've been practicing my lunges, I have not been thinking of which tempos I'm using when I do my lunges. I feel like I've been using most of them, except maybe...
And that's okay when you start, because right now when you start, you're just like trying to get used to that like good form.
Right.
And like most people, they always try to perfect their lunge with like sword before body and all this, and then they have like this perfect lunge that like always uses all their tempos because they're not registering all the different tempos. Most people don't even realize all the different tempos they have. They don't even realize that each joint is a separate tempo. So there's a lot of people that don't even parry just by squeezing the hand. They like always parry by moving the arm or moving the wrist or feet and things. So a lot of people, some people will say you have to always step when you parry to give yourself more time, right? But you are using two tempos there. You should create space a lot of time to give yourself more time. But if you're good enough and you just know the tempos and the measure, then you don't have to do that. You know how to save which ones.
Right.
So for like example, like the hand tempos are like a lot of times really important. So say if you attack me and then I just use my feet, like my hand can do a ton of things. I can just squeeze to come up,
right.
I can thrust forward, I can move my body for a cut, and you have all these different options. And so whenever you're attacking me, say you throw a descending cut at me, and I go, okay, he's used the tempo of his shoulder and used the tempo of his elbow. But he still has the tempo of his body, he hasn't stepped yet, and he still has the tempo of his wrist.
Right.
Well, I think to myself, the wrist is a very fast tempo, okay, so I need to make sure I have my wrist tempo to stop your wrist tempo, and you haven't used your feet yet, so you might change that distance. So I need to think to myself, which tempos left do I need to save? I probably need to save the tempo of my wrist just in case you mutate your wrist. I can equalize that speed, and I might need to step because of where you're coming. If I want to make it equal and simple, I could be like, okay, he used his shoulder and his elbow. So
right.
I'm going to use my shoulder and my elbow to parry. Because just in case, if you go to step and disengage, because you still have the tempo of the wrist and the tempo of your feet,
right.
then you're going to step to disengage to thrust. So you'll step forward while disengaging.
Like this?
Yep. Now I still had the tempo left of my feet and my wrist.
Oh.
So I can counter your attack because I matched all your tempos on speed. Now, if I know that I'm faster than you, then I definitely know I can win this situation.
Right, because from here, the only tempo I think I have left is this hand and my other foot.
Correct.
My right foot, and that's not going to let me do too much stuff.
Nope, and my sword I parried up enough that your other hand can't grab it. So
right.
For example, let's run that again, okay? So you throw this descending cut, and I go...
so I'll probably be here.
Yep, and I go, okay, he's used shoulder and elbow, so I'm going to use shoulder and elbow, and I'm just going to do this simple parry like this and try to gain your weapon.
Okay.
And then I go, when I do that, there's a good chance he's going to disengage and step because he has those left. So now I am going to save my wrist.
Right.
So when you use your wrist, I can use my wrist and step, right?
Okay.
But what I could even also do is try to beat what you're doing. So say you throw that cut, and I look at the tempos you use, boom, and I go here and I see that you're going to disengage, and I still have the tempo of my wrist and my feet, so you disengage
right.
from your thrust, I actually cut and step to the side. The one to think about is what happens if the opponent uses the tempo of their feet, they also turn their hips, and they extend their arm all the way like this, right? And cover the second line. Then now what's happened is they've used all their tempos except the tempo of the wrist.
Okay.
So they use all their tempos in one lunge, the same lunge most people practice. So now you know when they parry, they're either going to disengage or they're going to cut. Because
right.
they only have the tempo of the wrist left, right? So say you throw that attack to me. Okay, so just a full lunge, right?
Okay.
Boom, spend everything, and you cover the second line. So I go, which tempos does he have left? Doesn't really have any tempos left. So I go, do I want to use all my tempos up and step and like parry with my hand and like all this? Like I don't necessarily may not want to do that, okay? Maybe I have to step, okay? Right? And then we also cover the weapon to save the tempo on the repos, right?
Right.
But I know you have the tempo of your wrist left, so when I step, I don't want to use my wrist to gain your weapon.
Oh,
because now if I step and I use the wrist, then you can disengage or you can cut, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if it's at the wrist, then now when you disengage, I have to use my elbow to match it.
To come back, okay.
So instead, like if you throw that attack, okay, what I might want to do is step back and then just squeeze my hand for my parry, because now I still have the tempo of the wrist, I still have, and again, the weapon too, and I still have the tempo of the elbow.
Yeah, because then the only thing I can really do is just disengage or... Because without having anything, I don't even think I'd be able to mutate.
Exactly. So...
Because I'm already too far out.
So we really just want to think to ourselves and pay attention which tempos the opponent use. If they're using a ton of tempos, so say you lunge, you use all your tempos and I just squeeze my hand and step. Now I have like a ton of different things I can do. I can free it with my hand. I can use my wrist for a cut. I can use my body, and I can use my feet or my arm extension and all these different options. So it's really just breaking down to, once you get to the high level, knowing exactly which tempos they spent, why they spent them, and then saving your tempos. It's not about sword before body. It's not about whether or not to do sword before body. It's purely about saving the tempos you need for when you need them. And everyone is overlooking this. They're so worried about, do I do sword before body? Do I not do it? When it's like, okay, if you know the hand tempo is the fastest, people are getting obsessed with, do I use this first or not? That's not the answer. It's when do I use it? When do I use my fastest tempos? When do I save my fastest tempos?
Okay.
When do I use my slowest tempos? When do I use the tempo that allows me to mutate more? The tempo that allows me to void, the tempo that allows me to gain range. So it's all about understanding all the separate segments to know when to use them, why to use them, and how to counter which ones your opponent is using. Most people aren't even aware of it. They're just aware of hand and feet.
Yeah.
So it's a thing. Well, let's do more covering the line drills with the spear.
Oh, yeah.
Cover that a little bit more.
I will say, though,